So, full disclosure, I didn't finish the slides, so this talk is going to be a little bit more informal, as is tradition with Builderfest. The original title of this talk was Hydrozoa Flexible and Lightweight State Channels for Cardano. It's been a title that I've been reusing for the past 2 years or something, every time I talk about Hydrozoa. But Hydrozoa is very quickly becoming Gummy Worm's single head consensus protocol. And I think very soon that will be how people will probably think about it, right? Or in other words, you can think of Hydrozoa as the skunkworks name of what eventually becomes, part of Gummy Worm, right? So this may be one of the last presentations that will actually call it Hydrozoa. So, but we'll see. Maybe we'll keep it around for a little longer. Where to begin? The purpose of this consensus protocol is to manage what I call the joint ledger. You have an L1 ledger connected with an L2 ledger, and you want to keep them in sync, right? And specifically, when I'm talking about the L1 ledger, I'm talking about it in a prospective sense, right? So here, the idea is that there is some set of the Cardano L1 ledger state that belongs to us, we're to the head, right? That we control, and we don't care about what's currently going on in Cardano. We really don't. What we care about is what will be the Cardano state if everything that we've agreed to do to it happens, right? That's what I mean when I say prospective. Why does this matter? It means that if we're clever about how our consensus protocol works, we never have to slow down to check what's happening in Cardano. We are generating a deterministic sequence of effects that we will kind of multi-sign, we'll reach consensus on them, and we'll send them to Cardano. And if they don't go through, we'll resend them. And we can just have a bot running that will just, keep submitting to Cardano until Cardano gives up and says, yes, you're right, this is the L1 state, right? So that's why the prospective L1 ledger matters. Now, in terms of the L2 ledger, the key word is black box, right? So as far as the consensus protocol is concerned, it doesn't know nor really care what the ledger rules are or even what the ledger state is of the L2 ledger, right? Instead, it looks at it from a more abstract lens, right? Specifically, and this is something that Pi was saying earlier, what the consensus protocol cares about is that the ledger rules have this, respect certain invariants, right? So if you submit if you submit a request and it's been sort of accepted as valid, and it's it has its outcome has occurred, right? If you resubmit the same request again, nothing should happen, and it should be declared to be invalid, right? Because you don't want these things to be replayed. That's kind of idempotent. The other one is that, well, anyway, there's a few other ones. So just very basic rules, similar to what you would expect from something like UUTXO, right? Should be respected by these domain-specific ones. I can't remember them right now off the top of my head. I have them in a spec somewhere, so we'll maybe link to it later. And then other than that, what the consensus protocol keeps track of is a mapping, so to speak, from the L2 ledger state. There needs to be a mapping from the L2 ledger state to a set of UTXOs that will be released on L1 should consensus fail as of this point, right? Because since it's a multi-sig protocol, that means that if a certain number of people withholds their signature, from here on, that means that our consensus is stalled. We cannot make any more progress. So there's nothing to do but release the funds on L1, right? So that's the responsibility of the consensus protocol, to make sure that we know what the evacuation plan is, right? And lastly, occasionally, the L2 ledger will say that, hey, I have processed this request, I believe it's valid, and as a consequence of this request, certain payouts need to be remitted immediately on L1, right? And it's the job of Hydrozoa, which is interfacing directly with L1 to do this. The L2 ledger itself is not interfacing with anything, right? In fact, the only thing that the L2 ledger is interfacing with is Hydrozoa, right? The only source of information for the black box L2 ledger are the things that Hydrozoa sends to it, right? Once it has established like the global sequence of events, or like the global sequence of requests, right, that it wants to feed into this. And so the task becomes, how do we get a group of peers to agree on this global sequence of events or of requests, right? And the like their valid, invalid statuses, essentially, right? So first, let's take a look at what are the two request types. One is called a deposit request. So this is a request to update the L2 ledger state, right? But it's conditional on some deposit, some value being absorbed from the L1, right? Because obviously, like running an L2 ledger that isn't backed by anything on any L1 is kind of pointless, right? Like you're not really, your L2 state is not backed by anything, right? And you might as well just be running, I don't know, the spreadsheet or something, right? So you kind of want things to be backed by actual real L1 funds. So that's what these deposit requests exist for. They're always kind of contingent upon the deposit being absorbed into the head at some point, right? And then the other one is a transaction request. This is a request that does not depend on anything outside of the L2 ledger state, and is simply a state transition on, on that L2 ledger state that should happen immediately if it's valid, right? So two very simple types like that. And so one of the insights, this is kind of Pi alluded to, roughly around summer last year or September of last year, I thought that, or I realized that in the multi-sig consensus protocol, we know who the peers are. So we can think of it as like the requests are coming from pipelines from each peer, like sequences of requests are being emitted by each peer to all of the other peers. And we can identify each request by which peer originated that request within the system, right? And our task is to merge these into a single sequence, right? So for example, Alice, peer 0, right, has a transaction request, deposit request, a couple more transaction requests, a couple more deposit requests, and so on. Bob has his own, Carol has his own, right? And so what we want to do is go from this to this. Rajan in here? I think he would have commented that with George, everything turns into merge sort. So yeah, that's basically the first thing that we want to do, right? That's the first big task, right? And this, once we've done this, then we can talk about putting check marks or X's on these requests, right? So once we've decided what the sequence of them is, and we all agree on it, then we can feed it into the black box L2 ledger, apply its rules, and the L2 ledger will tell us, is this request valid or invalid, right? And if it's valid, what's the outcome, right? What's going to be the change to the evacuation map, and what's going to be the immediate payout or payouts if needed, right? So yeah, and what we've described here is essentially what Hydrozoa's fast consensus does, right? So it's a very fast spinning consensus between a small number of peers that can actually be co-located in the same data center, and that's fine, right? And they're in charge of determining the sequence of these events and determining the outcomes of these events. And it's kind of a replicated state machine model. They're all running the exact same, black box L2 ledger, initialized with the exact same state, and they've all fed the events into it that they have determined, like in the sequence that they have determined collectively, right? Now, who gets to decide the sequence? We have leaders and we have followers, and we rotate them after every block, right? So if Alice is the leader now, Bob is going to be the leader next time, and then Carol, then Danielle, then Aaron, then back to Alice, right? And so the leader is feeding feeding requests into the black box ledger as they come in the order that they come in, that the leader receives them in. And then once he's done that, and he's closed off the block, by the way, the leader closes off the block as soon as the previous block gets all the signatures from the peers, right? So it's very similar to Hydra in that way. So once that's done, and he closed off the block, he's going to send out this thing we call a block brief to all the other peers. And the block brief contains very concise instructions of how to replicate a state. So the block brief is going to talk about, it's going to talk about what is the merge sequence of the newly received events that the leader has received. What were the valid invalid flags of those events as the leader saw them when he fed into his black box L2 ledger? Which deposits did the leader decide to absorb? And which ones did he decide to reject, either because they have expired or they have been rugged? They were supposed to exist by now, but when we took a look, they don't exist, so we're going to reject them. We're not going to risk trying to absorb them for reasons. And that, in a nutshell, is what fast consensus does. And it can operate very quickly, and it always only needs one round of signature gathering for each block, right? Because literally you have a leader, he produces a block brief, he sends it to all the followers follow the block brief's instructions to reach the same replicated state as the leader, and if everything is right, then they emit their signature, essentially, to confirm this, soft confirm this block. Yeah. Which conflict, what kind of conflict are you thinking about here?
So the whole point of a consensus is to find consensus when there is conflict. If everyone agrees all the time, you don't really need the consensus. If one of the nodes computes differently, they will reject likely the signature of that particular sequence. So how does the fast consensus resolve that?
Right. So here it's kind of similar to Hydra. If one of the fast consensus nodes disagrees with what the leader has done, right, that node is going to withhold its signature, and therefore this block is not going to get confirmed, right? And so what we're going to do is consensus stalls, and we go to dispute resolution, where we find out where each peer has one vote to say, okay, this is what I believe was the last thing that we all agreed to, right? And then based on that, we can start evacuating funds, right? So if a sufficient number of nodes disagrees and consensus stalls, we simply evacuate based on the last thing that we all agreed. And if we haven't agreed on anything since initialization, then we evacuate the funds according to what was declared in initialization. So there's always like a fallback, right? There's always an evacuation plan no matter what happens, right? That's right. But on the flip side, if consensus holds throughout, then we never actually need to execute any evacuation plan, right? So, for example, actually on the next slide, I'm going to talk about the block effects, right? So far we've mentioned block briefs, which are just a summary of the decisions that were taken in terms of how to run this replicated state machine, right? Once you have those and you have fed the requests into the black box in that sequence, and you got back from the black box for each request, it's going to say, okay, the evacuation map needs to be updated in this way, and these are the payouts that need to be remitted, right? And also, if you tell the black box that, okay, I've decided to absorb these deposits and reject those other deposits, the black box is going to tell you, okay, the evacuation map needs to be changed in this way to take into account these absorbed deposits, right? Because that's new L2 state that's being backed by new funds that had just been kind of absorbed into the head, right? So you gather all of these up, and using this information, you're able to derive effects that you're going to send to L1. So for example, initialization is in the very beginning. This sets the L1 state that you start with and the L2 state that you start with, and they have to be kind of in sync, right? The L2 state has to be properly backed by whatever funds you've brought into the L1 state, otherwise you're insolvent, right? So that one's pretty simple. But for example, if you have a block brief that says we have decided to absorb some number of deposits, right? Or we've decided to remit some number of payouts, or we've decided to offset the fallback effects, dead man switch time. I'll talk about that a little bit later, right? Then we need to generate a settlement effect. And on Cardano, if Cardano is the L1, this is just a simple transaction, right? That spends the head's treasury UTXO, right? It's going to spend some of the it's going to spend the deposits that we decided to absorb. It's going to pay out or remit the payouts that we decided to remit, right? And then it's going to produce the updated treasury UTXO that contains the balance of the funds, like the net, right? And so every time that there's a block that kind of involves, like interacts with deposits or payouts and stuff, you need to have a settlement transaction generated like that, right? Similarly, finalization is triggered by one of the peers, one of the head peers, when they decide that, okay, we want to wrap this up, right? Because no head necessarily has to run forever. So at some point, one of them is going to decide to wrap things up. And we have a mechanism to do it in a nice way. So evacuation is the less nice way, because evacuation means that, oh, we have to go to a rule-based regime that's being governed by Plutus, and then we have to go through dispute resolution to figure out what is the actual evacuation plan that we're going to execute. And then we have to interact with Plutus scripts by providing like KZG cryptographic proofs of membership to say that, okay, this output that I'm trying to pay out of the rule-based treasury belongs to the evacuation plan, right? So that's less nice. Finalization does it much nicer because it's a simple, like, if consensus still holds, nothing is stopping the peers from simply multi-signing a transaction that just does it simply. Spend the treasury from the native script address, like the multi-sig address, and just pay out everything according to the latest evacuation map, right? No Plutus scripts need to be invoked at all, right? Just simple outputs, right? And the same thing with initialization, settlement, and finalization. All of the kind of, while consensus holds, like the happy path transactions, all of them are just native script transactions, very cheap, and very small. So for example, a settlement transaction can actually absorb something like 400 deposits, right? Very easily, because it doesn't need to invoke a bunch of logic to validate them. It's just a multi-sign transaction. And it can pay out a similar number, depending on the datums and stuff, of payouts, right? And in fact, Hydrozoa doesn't limit you in the number of payouts that you can handle per block, because if they don't fit into a single settlement transaction, then we have these things called rollout transactions, where you pay out as much as you can out of the settlement transaction, and whatever doesn't fit, you pay it out in aggregate, and then you have a subsequent transaction that's going to pay out more out of it, right? So you can have just a sequence of transactions of payouts that remits all the payouts, right? So these are the block effects. The last block effect is the so-called evacuation commitment. This is a contingent effect, right? It won't happen unless consensus stalls, right? This is what I was talking about. So the evacuation commitment is a cryptographic commitment pinning down some evacuation map, right? And so it's only used if we go to dispute resolution mode, right? Like if consensus stalls and we go to dispute resolution, each peer can present an evacuation commitment. Each evacuation commitment mentions which block version it has. So then you can use that to determine what was the latest block, right, that we all agreed to, that is compatible with what's currently sitting in the treasury. Because you'll also notice that the settlement effects, every time they happen, they are changing the balance of funds in the treasury because they absorb some deposits and they remit some payouts. So if some of the settlement effects didn't actually occur when we went into fallback, like when we fell back to the dispute resolution, then we can't necessarily use any snapshot we want. We can only use the ones that are compatible with what's actually sitting in the treasury, right? So that's kind of another one of those considerations. So yeah, those are the block effects. I'm going to pause there in case there are any questions, because I tend to kind of go really fast. Sebastian.
So as you probably keep on now with the slow consensus, I was wondering, does what you presented so far work also like that in isolation? Like it is like that it's safe that at least one of the 5 parties you showed by example, for example, as one of them is honest, they can actually realize these things back to layer 1. It is safe in isolation, or does it always require this kind of slower consensus round around, basically to take these commitments you put down and realize them in a dispute?
Yeah, this is actually a great segue to slow consensus and the split of responsibilities. So fast consensus is responsible for making decisions. Slow consensus is responsible for verifying those decisions and authorizing the custodial aspects of those decisions, right? So no funds can come in. It's funny. So no funds can come in or out of the head without the slow consensus peers sufficiently multi-signing it, right? And in terms of thresholds, fast consensus is unanimous, right? Because, well, actually it could be M of n, but right now it's unanimous. Slow consensus can be threshold, or should be threshold, because
I have a follow-up exactly that way, right? So if you always require the slow consensus to actually have these effects realized on layer one, the unanimous fast consensus is maybe very conservative, right? You could actually do kind of more like raft, like leadership rotation. If you don't have an agreement, you rotate the leader, and maybe another suggestion can continue the fast consensus. So it can pick up, be more resilient, because the ultimate safety, Byzantine safety, comes from the slow consensus anyways.
Yeah, that's right. So, but the reason why fast consensus is unanimous right now is because we don't want to have forks. So we want to just have a linear sequence of decisions, right? If you start introducing M of n and fast consensus, all of a sudden you have different coalitions that might be battling each other, and you complicate everything. And you might even get like more slowdown because you have to figure out which coalition prevails and so on. And you can't just keep going. Like as soon as you hear about the previous decision, you just know what the next like one is, right? Because, for example, in fast consensus, the current leader can close off, he knows where his block starts as soon as he sees the block brief from the previous block, because he knows which were the events that haven't been mentioned by any of the block briefs before. So he knows like where his sequence starts, right? Like where his block brief starts. And so he's able to very quickly like keep going with this, right? As soon as you introduce forks, now you have to figure out, okay, I'm building a block brief that's based on this fork if it gets selected, but I also have to have a different one if the different fork gets selected. I think it gets complicated very quickly if you do it that way, right?
Sorry, my question might be dumb, but I'm not a consensus guy. But I do understand correctly that in this system there is no support for adversarial node, right? Adversarial behavior, right? Because as soon as somebody misbehaves, the whole thing just stalls, right?
That's the nature of multisig, right?
Yeah.
So any kind of multisig, if it's unanimous multisig, a single adversarial node that stops participating stalls consensus, and we go to evacuation. But it's actually not too bad. Like evacuation, like the whole backup plan with these evacuation maps will ensure that no funds get stranded, right? If consensus stalls, everybody will get their funds out, right? And in fact, if consensus stalls, you probably don't want to keep your funds in there anyway, because there's something kind of fishy going on in there. So it's a kind of as simple as that.
Okay.
What's that? Yeah. And actually, one honest node is like there's a lot of use cases that rely on the one honest node assumption and are kind of fine with it. You just have to kind of calibrate, is this appropriate for your use case?
And that's one honest node for liveness. You could have all of the small consensus colluding, and they still can't touch funds, right? So it's stronger than one honest node for custody, but it's one honest node for liveness.
Yeah. So now let's talk about custody.
Sorry, real quick before you move on.
Oh.
Over here.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, just I think you probably addressed this, but going on with what Alexi was saying, so then if you do hit the evacuation state, then basically what it's the last thing everyone agreed on, that's what gets settled?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah. That's precisely it. Like if consensus stalled, the last thing that we all agreed on, that's what gets evacuated.
Got it.
Right?
Nice.
If consensus doesn't stall, we can just, keep moving at the rate of, how fast we can agree about things.
When you say the last things, it is the last thing the slow consensus agreed?
Yeah.
Which means that in the fast consensus, you can't really rely on the state to be settled, really? You have to wait for the slow consensus to settle things?
Yeah, there's two types of confirmations. There's soft confirmation and hard confirmation. Soft confirmation happens when fast consensus has agreed to it and made the decision about it, right? And the reason why it's important, like you might want to know that something has been soft confirmed, is because now there's only one option, right? The decision has been made, and now either this decision will be accepted by soft consensus or it will not be accepted. Slow consensus can't change the decision. They can only accept it or reject it, right? So it's similar to how, like, I don't know, for Supreme Court nominations in Canada or something, right? I forget what exactly the way exactly it works, but let's think of it like this. The Law Society of Canada, right, presents 3 options to the Prime Minister, and he chooses one of them, right? So like his choice has been constrained. In this case, fast consensus constrains the choice entirely to just one thing that can happen, or 2 things that can happen, right? Like the decision happens or it doesn't happen, right? And that's all that's the slow consensus can do, right? So it's very controlled in that way, right? So, all right, so slow consensus is about the custody aspect, right? So nothing can happen like in terms of the custody of the funds unless slow consensus agrees to it. And it works in parallel and at a slower pace than the fast consensus. We call the subset of peers that participate in slow consensus, we call these the COIL peers. And this is what Pi meant when he was talking about the COIL network before, right? And what the COIL peers are doing is they're verifying the block briefs from fast consensus, they're generating the block effects, and they are multi-signing the effects so that they can be executed on L1, right? Without this happening, like the results of fast consensus are kind of irrelevant because nothing will happen, right? And the interesting thing is that we can do this with whole stacks of blocks at a time. So you can imagine fast consensus is very quickly producing soft confirmed blocks, right, represented by their block briefs. And these are kind of stacking up in some, like in slow consensuses like mempool or like Q, essentially, right? And slow consensus also has like a leadership schedule, right? And the leader, what the leader does is every time the previous stack of blocks has been hard confirmed by slow consensus, he says, all right, here's the new stack of blocks that we're all going to confirm in this round, right? And he kind of publishes that out. And then all the other, like all the COIL peers are going to take a look at that block stack. They're going to wait until they have received all of the block briefs corresponding to it. They're going to verify them. They're going to generate the block effects for them, and they're going to multi-sign them and send out those multi-signatures. And the nice thing about stacks of blocks is that we can actually eliminate a lot of redundant work. So for example, suppose my stack has 1,000 blocks, but none of them contain any settlement effects. None of them are absorbing deposits or remitting payouts. All they're doing is just replacing the evacuation map, right? Well, in principle, the slow consensus peers, they only need to multi-sign the evacuation commitment of the very last block in this stack. They can skip the first 999 because there's no point, right? The last one is going to prevail over all the other ones. No one's going to vote for it, or no one should be voting for it anyway, because if we're atomically multi-signing this entire block, the stack of blocks at a time, then we should only be multi-signing the very last evacuation commitment in it, right? It gets a little bit more complicated if you do have some settlement effects in between, because settlement effects, as I mentioned before, they change the balance of funds at the Treasury. So evacuation maps are kind of, there's a compatibility aspect to evacuation maps, right? So an evacuation map is only compatible with the Treasury state of the settlement effect that you mean, like the last settlement effect before it, right? So every time you have a new settlement effect, it sort of invalidates all the old evacuation commitments, right? Because now you have a different balance of funds in the Treasury. So long story short, when you have, in the general case of a stack of blocks, what we do is we partition the stack by the major version increments, i.e. by like each time there's a new settlement transaction in the block, we kind of create a new partition, right? And then within that, we only need to sign the last evacuation commitment. So sorry, this is a little bit abstract. I didn't have time to draw the diagrams, but in a future talk, I probably will.
The thing that really clarified this for me, if you think about slow consensus and you think, oh, well, it's just going to fall behind, and now it's 5 days behind where the fast consensus is, so what is the benefit of transacting there? It's not necessarily that it's slower, it's at a slower cadence. And because of this effect of being able to kind of skip large stretches of transactions and only sign whatever that latest snapshot is, it allows it to keep up with that fast moving head, even though the consensus round is slower.
Yeah, and so in more practical terms, if you have a small number of peers in the fast consensus and they have good connections to each other, you can have block briefs be produced at a latency of like sub-second, right? Pretty comfortably, right? And so that tells you what the decision is. Like that pins down the outcome of these requests very quickly. And then slow consensus can catch up on the order of, I don't know, 5 to 10 minutes, right? Just multi-signing all the L1 effects that are going to be sent out for the whole block of stacks, right? And this is optimal in terms of throughput because the longer it takes for a slow consensus round to complete, the bigger your block stack is going to be. So you're just going to catch up like to everything that you missed that much faster, right? So it's kind of a self-regulating system in that way, right? So yeah.
I had a question which was a little bit like that, but there is a worst case scenario where you just have blocks in the slow consensus that are full of settlement transactions and they just keep stacking up. That is a potential edge case, but I'm not sure if.
Yeah, I mean, potential, like there might be edge cases where we just have a bunch of settlement effects and slow consensus might slow down a little bit to kind of deal with all of this because each settlement effect needs to be kind of multi-signed separately. That's kind of a limitation of Cardano right now, or not like Cardano and the way that we've decided to use it. So we're using these like simple multi-sign native script transactions. We're trying not to use Plutus, or that was originally how Hydrozoa wanted to do it. And the reason for that, by the way, is that script collateral is not very friendly to multisig right now because script collateral has to come from a single pub key address, right? So you can't multi-sign a transaction that contains Plutus without exposing yourself to the possibility that whoever the collateral belongs to might spend that collateral and invalidate that transaction. But with Hydrozoa, the point is that we want to generate a sequence of transactions that are definitely going to be executed and no one can unilaterally invalidate them. And that's why so far with Hydrozoa, we've been relying on native scripts and we've been avoiding Plutus scripts in the kind of happy path, right? Now that's going to change. There are a few SIPs coming down the line. In particular, we're curious to, 5 minutes? Perfect. Obviously there's way more to talk about and you can approach me and we can talk over drinks throughout the day and stuff. But anyway, just to complete this thought. So the nested transaction SIP might be very interesting because I believe the outer transaction contains the collateral and the inner transactions can be deterministically kind of signed, right? And then they can't be invalidated by simply spending some collateral. And more interestingly, maybe with nested transactions, the result of slow consensus can just be kind of a signed redeemer that is just being provided to each of the kind of sequence of transactions. And this reduces the number of signatures that we have to gather from the slow consensus peers, because now all they need to sign is a single redeemer that atomically authorizes the effects of the entire block, right? As opposed to signing each transaction that was generated as a consequence of the block individually, right? Which is probably going to be even nicer. So yeah, and then the other SIP that is going to make our lives a lot easier is the guard script one, because I haven't mentioned this so far, but the transition from kind of the nice multi-sig regime into the Plutus-based one operates with a dead man switch. So every time you sign a new settlement transaction, you're also signing a post-dated fallback transaction that will switch you to the rule-based regime if nothing else happens, right? And so the assumption is that if no new settlement transaction comes within a period of time, and this period of time is pretty broad, so like think of it as like if nothing new happens for 2 days, the assumption is that consensus is stalled, so the fallback transaction becomes valid, and we just go to the evacuation plan. And for this reason, by the way, in the normal course of operations with when the consensus is still holding, we will occasionally sign a settlement transaction that doesn't absorb any deposits or pay out any payouts. It simply moves the dead man switch forward so that we don't accidentally get into the evacuation plan. So I think that's it for today. As I said, lots more to discuss, so happy to talk over it throughout the day.